Hello, hello, hello again. Okay, here we are, part 3. This should be a slightly shorter section, I think, compared to the previous 2. So, I left you at the end of part 2 thinking about how would you measure your own well-being if you wanted to measure it. Maybe you went off and looked on your phone app thing to see all the different kind of well-being measurement and happiness measurement apps that there are. Okay, so you've been through now very quickly some different types of measurement, and really you want to think about why measuring well-being is important. So one is so that you can develop theories, okay? So it's handy to know whether well-being consists of certain things, isn't it? Do some people have high well-being even though they lack something that's considered key? Now that's an interesting question in terms of when we were talking about subjective and objective. Okay, so think about some of those eudaimonic measures like psychological well-being and PERMA and how they're prescribing what well-being should be. Is it possible that some people can score highly or have high well-being even though maybe they don't have some of the things that those well-being concepts are saying they should have, like engagement or relationships, something like that? Okay, the question, does well-being consist of certain specific things? Well, that's being answered in a number of ways. We've got the more objective measures that are prescribing what well-being should be and then deciding what they think high well-being is. But we've also got the subjective measures that are almost like a bit of a black box. They're letting people decide what they want well-being is. And something you can do, which is what I've done in my research, is ask those really subjective measures, use those really subjective concepts, and then ask people what they're thinking about when they answer them. In other words, we can find out what it is people are using and bringing to mind when they answer those really subjective questions. So then we can develop theories about what high well-being or good well-being really is. We can also identify relationships. What aspects of life are most closely linked to having high well-being? Should these aspects be nurtured? Can we fill gaps for people? Can people fill their own gaps? Should social policy reflect what is most important to well-being according to research? We'll get to this in a minute. And we can also use well-being measures to demonstrate change. Okay, it's really important if we're interested in well-being and what improves well-being and what people can actively do to improve their well-being, that we find out what interventions work best. Now, the last few years of positive psychology research have really focused on generalizations. Okay, in other words, these things relate to well-being. Recently, what people have been finding is that well-being is quite idiosyncratic. In other words, some things work for some people. It's not a one-size-fits-all. Not all well-being interventions will work for everybody. So being able to have a consistent measure that you use, that can be used across different studies, can really help show which interventions work best for which people. Also, some interventions only improve certain measures or definitions of well-being. Okay, if we measure well-being just as positive and negative feelings, do we get a different result than if we measure well-being using psychological well-being or PERMA? And of all of this, we need to remember what the point is about well-being, okay, and about positive psychology, that we were trying to shift maybe the focus of psychological research from negative or loss models to positive models, that they were studying positive aspects of life to help individuals and organisations and nations thrive and flourish, to look at whether there is a good way to live or an ideal way to live, and to try and increase well-being if we can, not only for those with low well-being to higher, but for people who maybe are in the middle or high and can go even higher. And the impact of the, if you remember from last week, the positive spirals, the impact that a shift in well-being can then have in broader aspects of one's life. Okay, let's look at an example. So in 2014, the government decided that they wanted to measure well-being in the UK, okay, for the entire nation. So again, this takes us back, doesn't it, to Bradburn and Andrews and Withy from the last lecture, okay? They want to know, how is the nation doing? How is the country doing in terms of well-being? So of course, as we know from last week and this week, to measure something, you have to define it. So they decided to measure well-being. Okay, they were going to ask people to rate their life satisfaction and more, I'll show you in a minute, to get a measure of well-being. So the argument was that economic growth, or gross domestic product, does not represent what a country is like as a whole. Now, we are not the only country to do this. I'll show you that in a minute as well. But what they decided to use was the Integrated Household Survey, which is a survey that gets sent out from the Office of National Statistics and asks the nation about their income, their health, their education, what food they buy. Okay, so very objective things, a bit like the examples we talked about right at the start of this lecture, really objective things about living life, but then it wanted to ask something more subjective about well-being. So let's see what they decided to ask. They asked in this survey to the whole nation, how satisfied are you with your life nowadays? Now we know that's satisfaction with life. How happy did you feel yesterday? How anxious did you feel yesterday? Now we know those. That's a positive affect feeling and a negative affect feeling. And then to what extent you feel the things you do in your life are worthwhile. So we know that as well. That's kind of a more kind of eudaimonic idea, isn't it, about purpose and meaning. So basically, our government decided to squish all that kind of research into well-being concepts and well-being measures into 4 questions. Okay, and they've been asking this now for quite a few years, so they've got quite a lot of data. And it's difficult to know really what exactly they did with that information. But you can access it, and that's something, if you're interested, drop a note either underneath the YouTube videos or in the Wellbeing Cafe, and we can direct you to where this data is. So, what I said before is that not only the UK is doing this. So there is something called the World Happiness Report that since 2012 has been doing a worldwide assessment of well-being, and they actually used the Cantrill's ladder that I showed you earlier. Okay, so they basically use Cantrill's ladder to assess the well-being of people across the globe. So again, what these measures do is they allow us to compare countries, they allow us to compare within a country, your different cities and areas, things like that. Okay, so of course we have to remember our issues with wellbeing research. There is not a clear definition as to what well-being is. What that means is that you need to be precise. Okay, so what that means is you can measure well-being in different ways, but you need to be clear about how you're doing it. So, for example, some studies will just use positive and negative affect. Okay, that's okay, but they have to be clear that that's what they're doing. They should avoid saying things like we're measuring well-being or we're measuring happiness, because they're not. They're measuring positive and negative effect. What this means is that you have to be careful comparing studies. You can't really compare a study that just maybe looks at mood and positive negative effect with a study that measures just life satisfaction, because remember, there are two different concepts. So you need to be very careful not to generalize conclusions from studies, but you also need to remember that the differences between studies may be important. In other words, if positive and negative effect are improved by something and satisfaction with life is not, or vice versa, what does that mean? So it's a challenge to come to clear conclusions and generalizations, because there is a bit of a mix of measures, but they're all still telling us something about well-being. There's also some other issues. For a long time, as I said to you before, there's been a lot of research into well-being and looking at well-being interventions, but they have tended to make generalizations in a one-size-fits-all way. And more recent research has been demonstrating that different improvements to well-being, different interventions or different relationships between life aspects and well-being vary according to people. Okay, in other words, you can't answer it with a one-size-fits-all kind of response. Some of that comes from the fact that there haven't been enough longitudinal studies. So, for example, people might test an intervention, they might test something that they think is going to improve well-being, but only do it as a one-off and not over a longer period of time. So well-being research definitely needs to have more longitudinal studies to reduce the effect of extraneous issues, of context, and to allow people to make sure they know what direction things are working in. In other words, is well-being improving because of the intervention that you've invented, or is it actually that people were maybe quite high in well-being anyway, or something like that? And they've also got to use, as we've established earlier, multiple methods in terms of measurement. So an awful lot of well-being studies just rely on self-report measures. And as we've discovered in part 2 of this lecture, the more measures you have, the more accurate your assessment of well-being is going to be. So, the other thing that we have to think about is whether well-being is just good for the person who is living it. Is there a broader idea of a community well-being? And you can think of that in terms of what's life been like and what's the world been like during the last year with COVID and during all the lockdowns. There's been almost a movement towards people thinking more about others and other people's well-being and the well-being of the community. There's potentially been an increase in voluntary work, an increase in people caring for their neighbours. Okay, and is there a point then where increasing well-being for everybody in a community also increases well-being for an individual? And is that better than an individual just worrying about their own well-being? Okay, so there's sort of quite a big philosophical question to ask there. And we still need to remember that a full measure of well-being should include feelings and one's own judgment and cognitive evaluation, plus anything else that we are interested in. Okay, Well, I think that's it for this lecture. Thanks for dropping by. You'll find any references you need in the reading list. And I look forward to seeing some of you in the live session on Friday. Okay, thank you and goodbye.